That's Peter's Island, Brier Island, Irish Town, Westport. When I get off the ferry, you slow down. You slow down. You wave at people, you stop, you talk to people. On the way, you pass Dan Kenny's house and see what's going on there, the fishery.
Let me see. No tag on him.
No.
Yep. $28.74.
Is that for the one or for the two?
I guess I'll let you have both of them over here.
Beautiful spires of black spruce. Telling you how hard it is to grow in this habitat. Fan-like leaves. Fan-like leaves. This is one plant, that's another plant, another plant. Each one's coming from a separate seed that was planted a year ago. This plant is the eastern mountain avens, and it's always been a fugitive. It's always been a small Arctic alpine plant, also called Peck's avens, Peckii scientifically. And it only grows on the top of Mount Washington in New Hampshire and on Brier Island and one small bit at the end of the Digby Peninsula, and that's it. It's the rarest plant in eastern Canada. I think there might be a rarer plant in Ontario, an orchid, but this is the rarest plant in eastern Canada. So after the glaciation, this plant had been pushed down by the glaciers. It had been pushed down to West Virginia, and then things start to warm up. And the Bay of Fundy was starting to melt, and Nova Scotia had a huge ice cap on it, and that starts to melt about 13,800 years ago. Brier Island is one of the first places to have melted, and after that, this plant finds Brier Island, finds bogs that are starting to develop, and finds itself a home. And so it's been going with the landscape for 10,000 years. Found a really good place, the biggest bog on Brier Island, Big Meadow Bog. That Big Meadow Bog was, it's like you could say it was the larder of Westport, the village on Brier Island. It's also their backyard.
It was just a natural thing to look out that window or to go down through the meadow and pick berries, or go down through with my father on the sled to haul wood. And skate down through there. Memories. That was our pond. That was my grandfather's pond. They called it Jimmy's pond. Well, then Dad took it over and they cut ice in there. They had the long saws, that they'd cut through to cut the squares of ice, the blocks of ice. They'd be about that thick, I guess.
My dad and his cousin, they had, I think, well over 300 sheep. And those sheep were divided themselves, they divided up into clans. One clan would live in one area, one clan would live in another. I think there was like 4 or 5 different places we had to chase them down when they had to get sheared and we get the lambs. Run, David, run.
We had young cattle, and the young cattle all spent the summer around the big pond, which was the end of the bog. When I was a kid, I had 32 rabbit snares down across the big meadow, and I used to come out every night after school. Just as soon as school was out, I'd take off down to the big meadow, go to my snares, and I'd come out with 5 or 6 rabbits every night.
They used to hunt black duck in the pools and pick up cranberries for Thanksgiving or Jonesberry. This is what the Brier Islanders called the bake apple or the cloudberry. Only place in the world that this plant is called Jonesberry. And for a long time, after the settlers came, this was their life. It was also the life for the eastern mountain avens. And the mountain avens ringed that bog. The bog has swamps which are draining into it from the sides, and then the bog is a raised bog, so it has water draining down to the margins. In that region, which the ecologists call the lag, or the lag, it's a Swedish word, you have pools and the eastern mountain avens. Until people wanted to reclaim the bog. Reclaim is the wrong word because it was never agriculture. It was a peatland. Really important for carbon, really important for biodiversity. But then we think that we need to turn this from a wasteland into something useful. And so there were 2 big ditches, one dug down the center and one dug along the east. And for 2 years they were at it and they trenched the bog.
And they went on and on for quite some time. I don't know how long it took for them to ditch that, but that bombardier thing we called it bombardier back there. They didn't know the freaking difference. But it had a backhoe in the back, and the big thought from that was growing blueberries. I don't think that turned out too well. And then they decided they were going to try to grow some garden, like vegetables and that. And I think the only thing that grew were carrots that weighed 5 pounds each or something like that down there. Nothing else would grow.
The community, because of the ditching, had lost their backyard. There was a trail that we could see in the old aerials. And when we asked Dave Pugh, he said, yeah, I used to go back there, and other people used to go back for berries. I used to go back and hunt ducks in the ponds, which are no longer there. And after that time, and after the ditching, everything grew up. There was a physical hindrance. There were alders. It was hell walking from Westport, and we've done it. We've fallen down, and we've been angry in the alders. This is the 1958 ditch. This is the south part of the bog. The ditching did 2 things. It caused the gulls to come in and pollute the bog. But the second thing that was just as bad for the eastern mountain avens was the ditching lowered the water table, so we got vigorous growth of shrubs that outcompeted the rare plant. Bogs are low nutrient places where you get sundews and pitcher plants and heath plants and the eastern mountain avens. But the herring gulls were undoing all of that. The water table was low, so the shrubs were growing up, and there were trees in the middle of the bog that had been starting. It was a jumble. It was just a jumble. And people didn't think that you could do anything about it. They thought that this was a write-off. So I was there on a November day, and I guess I'd been to the bog 20 years before with my Professor Vanderkloot. And here I was, 20 years later, looking at the bog and measuring the ups and downs, and I heard this tinkling sound. The birds were singing, But there's this tinkling sound, and I'm wondering, what's that? And then to my horror, I realized that tinkling sound is a stream at the bottom of this 6-foot ditch. And for as long as I'd been alive, this bog had been bleeding out, had been draining out. And that's when I started getting emotionally invested. That's when I started getting angry, upset, appalled, all of those emotions, and realized I wanted to do something about it. And there were other people who wanted to do something about it as well. There was Sherman Boats, there was Sam Eaton, Environment Canada, and the province. They were wanting to do something. And that's when we started this restoration program. The plan was, let's put this in reverse. Let's get back to the original bog. Restore the bog, and you'll recover the Eastern Mountain Avens. And for, probably a month or two, we continued this project, not really knowing what we were going to do. And then Andy Sharp had relatives in England. Yorkshire had a lot of peat mining, a lot of ditching. They were taking peat from the depths of the bog, from borrow pits, and they were using that peat to block the ditches that had been made in the peat. And so once Andy found out about that, he and East Coast Aquatics, Mike Parker, they ended up putting about 150 ditch blocks throughout the meadow, blocking the central ditch and the western ditch, which was very small, and then this long eastern ditch. And by 2017, they'd blocked all of the ditches so that the water table started to go back up again. And that's what we wanted. We wanted to raise the water table so that the herring gulls would think that this wasn't a very good place to nest. We had a mantra that gulls don't like wet bums. But we didn't understand that gulls have a loyalty to the site and that they can build up nests. This is a herring gull nest, probably a second attempt. You can see that it's built up the nest. It's got moss to keep it all dry, feathers. This is a regurgitation pellet. This one contains mink hair. So the herring gull has flown across St. Mary's Bay, fed at mink farms, and we've got a clutch of 3 eggs. They can make a nice bowl of a nest and raise up that nest 20 centimeters perhaps above the water table and get back to where they were. So we have not lost any gulls, unfortunately. We've recently plugged this ditch. This was where we got the borrow peat. Plugged the ditch, made a berm. This has made a pond for ducks. It's also raised the water table, and we can see that immediately we've had the dying off of blackberries. We've had the dying off of tall shrubs. We've cut out big spruce that are 25 years old. Gradually, this raised water level is going to kill these shrubs and reintroduce native Eastern Mountain Avens habitat. There are enough signs of homeostasis, of rehabilitation, that if you leave nature alone, nature will put things back together. But it couldn't have put back together the bog because it had been trenched to 6 feet. We needed to intervene. We did science on chemistry, the greenhouse gas emissions from the bog, how they were greater than a natural bog, which is another reason why we wanted to restore this, how the gulls were also exacerbating the greenhouse gas emissions with nitrous oxide. So we knew where we wanted to go. We had 1,000 avens here when we started working in 2013, and now we have maybe half a dozen plants. We got half a dozen plants, but we're fighting to keep them, and we're fighting to keep the gulls out of here. And this is a technique which was used for keeping gulls out of tern colonies because we're trying to hold the line on the nutrients from the gulls. The gulls gave us a lesson in aeronautics. They're fairly good at flying, and they can actually hover. And so they would see our bamboo arrays, and they would hover, and they would slowly settle between the bamboo poles and find that that was a nice nesting place, perhaps because it gave them a refuge from aerial predators. We did science on how the eastern mountain avens germinates. Under what kind of conditions? Do the seeds germinate over winter, in the springtime? Do they need a cold snap? And then we did science on the breeding system. This garden of eastern mountain avens, they would be interbreeding. They're pollinated by flower flies called syrphids, by wasps, bumblebees, spiders come into them, crab spiders come into them, the male being really small, the female white and yellow lines herself up with the flower markings on the avens. So there's a whole community of insects which is around them when they flower. The eastern mountain avens used to be able to be pollinated by avens plants all around the bog. And this has real genetic implications because we know from pollination experiments that we've done right here in this bog that if we pollinate this plant with pollen from this particular bog, the progeny, the seeds that result, only have a 30% germination rate. But if we take pollen from across the bog, across Big Meadow Bog, 500 meters away, the germination rate goes up to 50%. So we know that outcrossing is necessary for genetic fitness. There's work being done on how climate change is warming the air, leading to shifts in the biological community. All through the permafrost, this is happening. We're wondering if this is also happening on Brier Island because we found that the temperature of Brier Island has gone up 1.7 degrees from 1960 to present day. That's the biggest change in temperature anywhere in Nova Scotia, and it's happening where we need it least.
Last year we decided to try and look into climate change and see what we could do to predict what the future for the plant might be based on this threat. So we built these structures, and they're called an open top chamber. What they do is they artificially increase the temperature a few degrees inside this chamber. We have some little gizmos in the center here. These ones are called hobo data loggers, and they're recording temperature and humidity at the very surface of the bog and just above the bog, and they're recording that every hour, day after day after day.
We looked at how the eastern mountain avens could survive in wetter places, drier places. What was its sweet spot? We've taken these shrubs off. We've taken 50 years of sphagnum growth away. We've got down to bare peat. And a year ago we sowed this, the whole thing, with eastern mountain avens. And now we can see that we've got some quite healthy looking plants. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we've got a goodly number of avens seedlings. They're all coming from different seed heads. This is where the avens took hold. Very cool. Well, I'm happy overall that I can see that we can bring the avens back, and if we can manage for shrubs, the avens can manage the rest. Things aren't going on a timetable that we would like. Things are going to take longer, but we've put back the process. We've put back the water table. And now part of it's going to be waiting, and part of it's going to be helping avens hang on while we restore the rest of the process. Why do we do it? We do it because this plant is rare, and if this were an animal, if this were a caribou, we would be up in arms. We're up in arms locally, but And this is a mark of how rare this plant is. Why do we do it? We do it because it's symbolic of so many ecosystems where we've undermined ecosystems and we walk away. But the other thing is you want to restore it because it's the right thing to do, because it really should act like a model for how to treat human disturbed landscapes. That we need to restore these landscapes. We need to restore them back to the point where they can sustain rare species. If we can restore Big Meadow Bog, 2 kilometers, 65 hectares of peatland, which has 10,000 years of carbon stored and can have another couple of thousand years of carbon storage if we restore it, then we will have done something useful. Going on the boardwalk is a taste of the bog, but it doesn't get us far enough. I want that boardwalk to keep going. I want it to keep going so people can walk past the Eastern Mountain Avens, can get to see it, can understand what the restoration was all about, and can realize the importance of what was done. Our boardwalk's only starting to get good. I'd like it to keep going so that people can go all the way to Pond Cove, and that would be a 2-kilometer walk.
I stand on deck, waves bathed in moonlight, gazing out o'er the sea. A falling star makes me remember the words that she said to me. And she said, oh no, you cannot go. You can't be leaving your life behind. But as the falling star leads to the sunrise, I'll be upon